A sitting American president just demanded operational control over a sovereign ally's farms, its slaughter houses, its export logs, and its production quotas. Not a trade negotiation, not a tariff renegotiation, not a request for better market access. Control. Donald Trump stood at the podium and said Canada's pork industry should serve American interests. His exact words were their biggest customer. We should have control over supply allocations. We should have oversight of production, and we should have the final say on where Canadian pork goes. If they want access to American markets, they give us control. That's the deal. That press conference was scheduled to discuss trade policy, but the pork demand was not in the prepared remarks. It came in response to a question about rising meat costs, and within 72 hours, those rising costs became a full-blown supermarket collapse because Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, did not negotiate. He did not counteroffer. He did not send a diplomatic note. He said one word, no, and then he did something far more devastating than refuse. He redirected Canada's entire pork export supply away from the United States and locked it into multi-year contracts with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, Mexico, the Philippines, and the United Kingdom. The full volume of pork that used to flow south to American buyers was gone, reallocated, signed, sealed, delivered to countries that had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Now, walk into any American grocery store. The pork shelves are emptying. Bacon is disappearing. Purchase limits on ribs, chops, and ground pork are appearing for the first time since the worst days of the pandemic. Not because of a drought, not because of a disease outbreak, not because of a supply chain accident, because the President of the United States demanded to own what he was already receiving freely, and that demand, not the refusal, killed the supply. Let us be precise about what Trump demanded because the language reveals the miscalculation. He said, Canada's pork industry should be serving American interests. That framing positions another nation's domestic agriculture as if its purpose is to service Washington. He said we should have control over supply allocations. That is not a trade ask. That is a command over another country's production decisions. He said we should have the final say on where Canadian pork goes. That is not a negotiation. That is a colonial statement. And then he closed with, if they want access to American markets, they give us control. That's the deal. Behind the scenes, reports emerged within days that Trump's own trade team had not been consulted on that language. Senior advisors learned about the control framing from the live broadcast. One trade official, speaking on condition of anonymity, said the demand went far beyond anything they had discussed or modeled. The word control had never appeared in any internal policy document related to Canadian pork. This was not strategy. This was the product of a president who had spent 18 months watching Canada outmaneuver the United States across energy, dairy, cooking oil, and critical minerals. He internalized each setback as a personal humiliation, and without consulting the people whose job it was to understand the consequences, he concluded that the solution to losing a trade confrontation was to demand ownership of the other side's assets. To understand why this was catastrophic, you need to understand how deeply integrated the American pork supply is with Canada. The United States consumes roughly 51 pounds of pork per person per year. Bacon at breakfast, ham sandwiches at lunch, pork chops at dinner, ribs on the weekend, hot dogs at genetic programs optimized for decades flow into American operations as the foundation of herd quality. Canadian feed inputs like barley, canola meal, and feed wheat supply the rations that American pork producers depend on to raise their animals to market weight. This is not a conventional trade relationship. This is a bastional production system where inputs, animals, and processing capacity are distributed across both countries as a single, interconnected operation. Disrupt that system, and you do not reduce American pork production by a percentage. You fracture it at load-bearing joints. Take the processing dimension alone. American pork processing plants in border states were designed, built, and staffed to operate on a continuous flow of live hogs from both domestic and Canadian sources. Remove the Canadian supply and those plants do not operate at reduced capacity. They operate below the minimum throughput required to cover fixed costs. That means they either run at a financial loss or shut down production lines entirely. Plant shutdowns do not just reduce pork output. They eliminate jobs. They devastate the small towns that depend on processing plant employment, and they create a secondary Supply chain crisis. As the plants that remain operational face the impossible math of serving national demand with regional capacity, the American pork processing infrastructure was not built for a Canada-free world. It was built for a world where Canadian hogs flow south and American processing capacity serves both nations' animals. Trump's demand did not just threaten that integration. It gave Carney the justification to end it. And Carney's response came during a formal address to the Canadian Parliament carried live by every international news network. He stood at the podium and said the President of the United States has demanded control of Canada's pork industry, our farms, our processing, our exports, our production decisions. The answer is no. It will always be no. And the actions my government is announcing today will ensure that this question is never asked again. Then came the actions. First, a complete suspension of live hog exports to the United States, effective within 14 days. Second, a redirection of all Canadian pork product exports to preferential international buyers under multi-year contracts. Third, a restriction on the export of elite pork breeding genetics to American operations. And fourth, an investment of 3.4 billion Canadian dollars in domestic processing capacity, new plants, expanded facilities, cold chain infrastructure designed to process Canadian hogs in Canada rather than shipping them south. The preferential supply agreements were the strategic kill shot. Within 72 hours, Canada signed binding multi-year pork supply contracts. The European Union agreement alone committed 400,000 metric tons of Canadian pork annually at prices competitive with European domestic production. Japan, the world's most valuable pork import market, where consumers pay premium prices for high-quality cuts, signed a deal that positioned Canadian pork as a direct competitor to the American products that had dominated the Japanese market for decades. South Korea, the United Kingdom, Mexico, and the Philippines followed. Every metric ton signed to an international buyer was a metric ton removed from the supply available to American grocery stores. And every contract was multi-year, meaning the redirection was not a temporary pressure tactic. It was a structural realignment of the global pork trade executed in 3 days, locked in for years. The international reaction went beyond commercial opportunism into outright condemnation. The European Commission's Agricultural Commissioner issued a statement calling Trump's demand incompatible with every principle of sovereign trade, explicitly framing the EU's new agreement with Canada as a demonstration that the democratic world will not reward economic coercion with compliance. Japan's trade minister said publicly that the demand had accelerated conversations already underway about reducing reliance on American agricultural supply chains. The United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand issued a joint statement affirming the sovereign right of every nation to control its own domestic agricultural production. Diplomatically unremarkable, but politically devastating because it confirmed that America's closest allies viewed the demand as illegitimate. Even Mexico, a country that depends on American economic partnership more than virtually any other, signed a preferential pork supply agreement with Canada within that 72-hour window. One Mexican trade official described it privately as insurance against being the next country told to hand over its farms. Within days, American grocery stores started bleeding out. The hemorrhage was visible before any economic model could quantify it. Visible in the meat aisle where pork shelves that had been fully stocked for as long as anyone could remember were now showing gaps, then sections, then entire rows of empty refrigerated space, with handwritten signs taped to the shelves reading temporarily out of stock, and limit 2 per customer. Bacon was the first product to show sustained shortages. Within 2 weeks, retail bacon prices increased 31% nationally, with some metro areas reporting increases over 40%. Pork chops, ribs, ground pork, ham, and sausage followed in a cascading pattern of scarcity. First, the premium cuts disappeared, then the mid-range, then the value products that working.